They didn't come to save her. They came to divide her 7 children. Then the stranger the whole town feared walked in and changed everything. Blackridge, the winter of 1887, 20-some men crowded into a cold meeting hall, deciding out loud which of Winifred Cole's 7 children were strong enough to be sent out as labor and which were too small to bother with, until Boone Calder, the mountain man nobody in that town claimed to understand. "I'll take all of them. Not the widow and 1 child. Not the 2 oldest boys hired out for the price of their keep. All 7, and their mother, besides, up the mountain, for as long as the winter lasted, and far longer than any of them could have guessed that night. If you have ever been left with nothing and refused to let it break you, this story is for you. Stay to the end, because what a scarred, silent stranger built that winter with a ruined widow and 7 children who weren't his own is the kind of family most people spend a lifetime chasing. And if a story like Winifred's is worth your evening, consider this. Become a channel member. It costs nothing. It takes a moment, and it's the simplest way to keep stories like hers coming. Now back to the beginning, to a cold hall full of men who had already decided her family's fate before she stood up to stop them. The meeting had run 40 minutes before anyone thought to look at Winifred at all, and in that she read everything about how the rest of it would go. She sat in the 3rd row of the old assembly hall, a converted feed store, the grain smell still living in the boards, her youngest pressed under her coat against her chest. Ivy was 14 months old and had run a low fever 3 days straight. She wasn't crying. She'd stopped crying much at all, and the quiet of her worried Winifred more than any wailing would have. The other 6 sat along the bench beside her, oldest to youngest, the way they'd learned without being asked, the older ones keeping a hand against the smaller ones to hold them still. Annie, 13, wore his father's jaw and his folded arms, cataloging every man at the front of the room. Silas, 12 and quiet, had Josie half asleep against his shoulder. The twins, Hattie and Nell, 10, sat with the particular stillness children learn early. The animal understanding that something large and possibly terrible is being decided just out of earshot. Ollie, 7, had run out of patience 20 minutes back and stared at his own boots, waiting for whatever came next, the way children wait for weather. Up front, the talk had drifted the way men's talk does when they're circling a hard thing, stores the burden certain households had put on a town stretched thin, until Cal Ashby, who ran what was left of the trading post, cut through it. We all know why we're here. The room went the quiet that comes right before something ugly gets voiced aloud. Reverend Amos Colby set down his paper of numbers and finally looked at her, Mrs. Cole. He began with the careful gentleness of a man diffusing something he'd rather not hold. This community cares about you and your children, but the reality of the situation requires a frank conversation. I'm sitting right here. You can speak to me directly. 7 children is a significant number of mouths. I'm aware of how many children I have. It was Lloyd Perrin who ran the livery and had never once mistaken bluntness for cruelty, who finally laid it out plain. The Draper place over in Ridgeton. Stop. Hard enough that Ivy startled against her. You are standing in this room talking about my children, like furniture you're trying to find room for. My son. My daughters. You have prices worked out already, don't you? Who takes Ivy? She's 14 months old. She still doesn't sleep through the night. We're not placing them. The Reverend tried again. We're ensuring their survival. The alternative is that I take care of my own children. With what? Cal Ashby was not cruel, and that was the worst of it, simply accurate. Your husband left you with debt and a leaking roof. Your stores won't carry 7 children through a mountain winter. 3 weeks. 4, if I stretch it. After that, I know outside, the wind had already begun the low moaning it made, coming off the high country, and Winifred had grown up here long enough to know the real winter hadn't even arrived. She looked around the hall, people she'd known for years, some who'd stood at her husband's grave, none of them monsters, only frightened people reaching for the solution that cost them least. She understood the arithmetic. She would rather die on this mountain than accept it. Give me a week. 1 week to find another way. The men traded the look of people who'd already agreed on an answer and were only waiting for a polite moment to give it. Reverend Colby clasped his hands. Mrs. Cole, I don't think. The door opened. No bang, no dramatic gust. It simply opened. Cold pouring in ahead of whoever stood in the frame, and the hall went still before anyone had registered a face. He was tall, taller than Lloyd Perrin, built through the shoulders like a man who'd spent years doing hard, necessary things. A heavy coat that had seen better winters. A scar ran from his left cheekbone to his jaw, old and fully healed, but set in a way that pulled faint tension into that side of his face. Eli leaned close to his mother's ear. Mama. She knew the name the way the whole town knew it, half legend, half warning. A man with a cabin somewhere above the timberline who came down maybe twice a year, opened his mouth only when a thing needed saying, and had, in every telling, once walked away from a fight with 3 men who hadn't. A dead wife featured in most versions. After that, the details scattered. He didn't look like a legend in that doorway. He looked like a tired man deciding whether to speak. Didn't know you were in town, heard you talking. Thin walls. Community business, I heard. He stepped in, let the door swing shut, and didn't move toward the front. Simply stood there, filling space that hadn't been filled a moment before. His eyes found Winifred first, and for a moment she had the strange sense of being weighed, precisely, with nothing comfortable in it. Then his gaze moved down the row of children. Eli's folded arms, the twins pressed together, Ollie's stilled legs, Josie asleep, and, last, the pale small face of Ivy peering from under her mother's coat. The look lasted 3 seconds. Then he turned back to the room. You're splitting them up. Not a question. We're making practical arrangements, Ashby started. Sending them separate, to strangers. The situation is what it is. Ashby had noticeably less certainty than before. I'll take all of them. The silence that followed had a different texture than any before it. Disbelief in it, calculation, a murmur starting somewhere in the back and spreading forward like a spill. I beg your pardon, the Reverend managed. The widow and her children. He didn't look at her while the words came out as though they cost him something he needed to spend before he could afford to meet her eyes. I've got room. I've got stores. Enough. Lloyd Perrin laughed, short and disbelieving. You live alone on a mountain, Calder. You've never even I know where I live. There are 7 children. As though, perhaps, the man had lost count. He looked at Winifred directly. Now, your choice, ma'am. I'm not forcing anything. She studied him, looking for the angle, the price, the thing he wanted that she hadn't yet found, because in her experience an offer that looked like rescue rarely was one. You don't know us. He was quiet a moment. Not a man hunting for a good answer, but a man with an honest one he wasn't sure was worth the trouble of explaining. Because they shouldn't be separated, that's all. It wasn't nearly enough. But Cal Ashby watched her with practical impatience. Ivy lay warm and too quiet against her chest, and outside the wind kept saying, "Winter, winter, winter," in a language anyone raised in this country knew how to read. She turned to her eldest. Allie's jaw was set, but his eyes, his father's eyes, asked her something he was already too old, at 13, to put into words. "Is it safe low?" Almost lost under the wind against the roof. Billy Crenshaw's brother traded up there once, said the cabin was solid, said Calder wasn't friendly. Not friendly isn't the same as dangerous. No, Mama. We can't let them split us up. She had already known the answer before asking. She only needed a moment to stand beside the knowing and be sure it was real. She rose, and Ivy stirred and settled again. "Mr. Calder, I have 7 children and nothing else, no money toward food. We will work for our place, all of us, old enough too. But I want your word, in front of these people, that my children will be safe. Not promises about spring. Just the winter." He held her gaze without flinching. "Then I accept." The hall erupted, benches scraping, opinions crossing in the air, the Reverend murmuring about how irregular it all was, Lloyd Perrin leaning to Cal Ashby. She was already working out what to pack, what to leave, how to move 7 children, and whatever she could carry up a mountain before the storm, she could feel building in the wind, actually arrived. They left Black Ridge at first light. Winifred had packed through the night by lamplight. The furniture stayed. The dishes carried west from Ohio mostly stayed wrapped in her husband Elias's old shirts. She took blankets, the cast-iron pot, her sewing kit, the small hoard of remedies built over 6 years of children hurting themselves in every creative way children manage. She took Elias's rifle, though she was only a fair shot, and hadn't touched it since he died because the only alternative was leaving it for good. The children mostly packed themselves. Eli made sure none of the younger ones overloaded what they'd have to carry. Silas quietly repacked Josie's satchel twice, trading a rag doll for her warm stockings, without being asked and without explaining why. Boone arrived an hour before dawn with a battered wagon and an old sensible horse named Samson. He loaded their few belongings without comment, fitting it all in with the same unhurried precision he seemed to bring to everything. The children watched from the porch. "He's scary," Addie decided. "He's big," Nell corrected, because Nell preferred accuracy to opinion. "Same thing," Ollie announced with a 7-year-old's total confidence. Josie had fallen asleep, standing against the doorframe, a small cloth fox named Bramble under one arm. Winifred locked the cabin door and stood a moment with her palm flat against the wood. 6 years of her life were behind it, and Elias too. In some way, she wasn't going to try explaining. She put the key in her coat pocket. "All right, let's go." The road ran 2 miles before it stopped being a road and became a suggestion, a trail worn by use through pine and frozen creek bed. The wagon managed the lower stretch well enough, but where the grade steepened, Boone stopped twice to redistribute the load with the precision. He didn't explain or ask for help, and Eli watched him do it with the beginning of a complicated reckoning on his face. They stopped once to let Samson rest, and once when Ollie needed to be sick at the trail's edge from the motion and the nerves. Both times Boone waited. No impatience, but no particular comfort either. From the bench beside him, a careful foot of space between them, She wanted to know how long he'd been up here. 8 years alone. She left room in the conversation for him to fill further. He didn't. The children will make noise, she tried instead. I can't keep them quiet all the time, especially the little ones. I know what children are. It'll be fine. She didn't quite believe him, but there was no weariness of resignation in it, a fact he'd already decided to hold to, and she supposed that was something. The cabin appeared in the last gray hour before dark, and it was not what she'd expected. Solid logs, notched with real skill and carefully chinked, a roof steep enough to shed snow and intact enough to do it. A wood pile, longer than anything she'd ever seen, the whole east wall of it. Inside, one large room with a sleeping loft, a fireplace built for serious heat, a table big enough for 6 in a pinch, and shelves stacked with jars and dried goods and tools she couldn't name. It's so quiet, Josie marveled, the reverence of a child who had spent her whole life sharing close quarters with 6 siblings unmistakable in it. Boone stood looking at all of them, looking at it, and something moved across his face that wasn't quite regret, but the recognition of something long settled, beginning to shift. Loft sleeps 4 or 5. You and the little ones by the fire. He stopped, apparently not having thought that part through. I'll sort the sleeping. The children can share the loft. Older ones on the outside. I'll keep the fire with the baby. Fine. And you? The outbuilding has a cot. You shouldn't. This is your home. It's not a conversation. He turned back to the fire. Hooks by the door for coats. Wells, 20 feet past the outbuilding. Keep the little ones off it. The cover's loose. Supper's mine tonight, since you don't know where anything is. Tomorrow you will. She watched him build the fire and thought, I have made an enormous decision on almost no information, with no way yet of knowing if it was right. But the fire is lit, and we are together. It wasn't hope, it was only the next thing. Supper was bean soup and dried venison, plain and filling, served without ceremony. The children ate in a silence unusual enough that Winifred checked several small foreheads for fever before understanding they were simply overwhelmed. After she settled the little ones, Josie down fast, the twins bargained into stillness over blanket rights. Ollie talked to sleep by Silas's low voice. She nursed Ivy until the baby went fully under and laid her in a nest of blankets by the fire, then came back to find Eli and Boone at opposite ends of the table, neither speaking. Bed, she told her son. Then lie there quietly and be awake, loft. Now. He went, but not without one long look at Boone that carried a dozen unasked questions, and Boone met it without flinching until the boy looked away. Winifred sat down across from Boone with a weight in her chest, mostly relief and partly grief. He's protective. It wasn't quite an explanation, and it wasn't quite an apology either. He doesn't have to settle for you, though. He's allowed to think so. Why did you do it? Not the version I asked in the hall, the real question. He was quiet a long moment, heard Lloyd Perrin name the Draper place, and knew what that meant. Draper works children like equipment. Seen it. Heard you say, I know what my stores are in a particular voice. And thought, he stopped, what? That you'd try the impossible alone, and fail, and they'd separate the children anyway. After a worse winter than this needed to be, at least this way, the odds are better. It was almost purely practical, and she trusted it more for that. I'll pull my weight, all of us will, I know. It didn't land as a platitude, more like an assessment already made. "Thank you." She stood smoothing her skirt out of old habit. "For tonight." He rose, moving for the door and whatever cold waited in the outbuilding. "Sleep while you can, Mrs. Cole. Weather's coming." She listened to the wind pick up after the door shut, looked at the fire, at her sleeping daughter, and thought of Elias, and of the empty house down the mountain with its key riding cold in her pocket. Outside, the mountain made its long sounds, and eventually, though it took a long while, she slept. The first week was among the hardest things Winifred had done since digging her husband's grave with her own hands. Not because Boone was unkind, and not because the cabin was unbearable, but because 9 people crowded into a space built for one creates a friction that has nothing to do with anyone being wrong, simply the physics of too much life in too little room. Mornings were the worst. Ivy woke before light, and her crying woke Josie. And by the time the baby was settled and the fire rebuilt, the twins were mid-argument over something. Boone came in from the outbuilding each morning at the same hour, face reddened from the cold, and walked into whatever chaos had assembled with an expression Winifred couldn't quite read, not anger, not amusement. On the third morning, he found Ollie standing on the table staring out the high window at the snow, with the total absorption of a 7-year-old in a space he was never meant to occupy. "Get down." Ollie climbed down slowly, performing his compliance the way children do when they want it noted as a favor. Boone crossed to the fire, poured coffee, stood with his back to the room, and Winifred caught the faint movement of his shoulders. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. He was not nearly as sealed off as he performed. The children sorted themselves around him in stages, the way animals establish territory. The twins, bold in the way of girls who've always had a built-in ally, were peppering him with questions about the tools on the walls by the 4th day, and he came back briefly and accurately, without the false brightness some adults perform for children. Had he learned by week's end that the notched logs on the east wall had taken 3 weeks to cut and fit, that Samson was 12 and had opinions about cold weather, and that the shelf above the fireplace— "What's a working tool?" "Tools I use for work." That's not a real answer. No, it isn't. Trapping equipment. Knives. Things that hurt you if you don't know how to use them. Nell immediately looked at the shelf with undisguised interest, which Winifred noticed and addressed. Later, Josie was afraid of him the first 5 days, pressed against her mother's side whenever he came in. On the 6th day, she was sitting near the fire with Bramble the fox when Boone stamped snow from his boots and found her frozen in his path like a startled deer. He crouched to her level, which visibly surprised her. Bramble. Good name. He stepped around her and moved on. She watched him the rest of the evening with confused reassessment, and after that she was less afraid. Not comfortable, but curious. Eli was a different problem. Not openly hostile, Winifred had made her expectations of courtesy plain on the wagon ride up, and he was courteous, technically, helped where directed, made no scenes. But there was a quality to his cooperation that read more like protest than participation. He watched Boone the way she'd once seen Elias watch men he didn't trust, not fear, a steady, careful counting. Boone, for his part, neither pushed the boy nor retreated from him. He gave Eli real work, not busy work, was plain with him when he'd stacked wood wrong and why it mattered, and never softened any of it. He treated Eli like someone whose help actually mattered and left the rest alone. He either knows exactly what he's doing, Winifred thought, or he doesn't think about it at all. Become a channel member. It's the easiest way to say thank you for a story like this one, and it takes about 10 seconds. Just tap Join beside the channel name. Cooking became Winifred's territory by the second day, not because Boone's food was bad, but because she needed one thing fully hers. Mornings meant lessons at the table. Silas, who had an unexpected gift for patience, teaching Ollie and Josie their letters, while Winifred cooked and Boone moved in and out at whatever the endless maintenance of mountain life demanded. Afternoons, when the light held, he went outside, and whoever wanted to follow, followed. The twins always came. Ollie came whenever he'd talked his mother into believing his lessons were finished. Boone showed them things without announcing he was teaching anything, how snow settled around a windward tree trunk, which ice on the creek would hold weight. He didn't lecture. He observed aloud, and if someone happened to be listening, they might learn something. One afternoon, Winifred came out to call Ollie in for supper, and found Boone crouched beside him in front of a set of rabbit tracks, the boy leaning in with the full 7-year-old attention he rarely gave anything. Could we catch it with a snare? Yes. Could you show me? A pause she'd already learned to read as genuine consideration rather than deflection. If your mother says it's all right. Ollie turned and found her watching. Mama, can I learn snares? She looked at Boone. He gave nothing away, wanted nothing more than a yes or no. After lessons. Ollie's whole face lit with the pure, uncomplicated happiness particular to 7-year-olds. She stood watching Boone across the cold yard, a man who'd spent 8 years guarding his solitude and had just handed a piece of it, without ceremony, to a boy who wasn't his. The real winter arrived at the end of their second week, and not gradually. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in a single night, and kept falling. The sky turned the white gray that meant serious snow, and then the snow came, the driven, horizontal kind, that found every gap in the walls and made the 20 feet to the outbuilding a real undertaking. On the third day of the storm, wind loud enough inside to raise voices over, Josie crying at the noise of it, Ivy feverish again. Winifred sat up half the night with the baby by the fire, thinking through all the ways things could still go wrong. Boone came in past midnight, snow-crusted from checking on Samson, and stopped when he saw her still awake. Baby sick, just a fever, she gets them. He crossed to the shelves and came back with a small tin. Fever paste. Willow bark mostly, and other things. My wife, he stopped, started again, the careful way a man does when he's wandered somewhere he hadn't meant to. Made it a while back. Rub it on the chest. Your wife? She left the space open rather than pushing. She died. Flat, not to end the conversation, and not entirely to keep it going either. The flatness of a fact, worn smooth by too many repetitions, 8 years ago. Fever took her. The same winter I built this cabin. I'm sorry. Long time ago, he pulled out the chair across from her and sat, snow still melting off his coat in small streams. Use it or don't. She worked a little onto her fingers and rubbed it carefully onto Ivy's chest, and the baby stirred but didn't wake. What was her name? A long silence, the wind making its long sound against the walls. Rose. She hated the cold. There was something so specific in that detail. Not she was beautiful, not she was kind, but she hated the cold, that Winifred felt the full weight of it settle. I'm sorry. She meant it again, and this time she meant the whole of it, what it costs to love someone in a hard place and lose them there. You get used to the quiet. He looked at his hands. That's the worst part. Then 9 people show up. Is that a complaint? She nearly smiled. Not exactly. Ivy shifted, made a small, unhappy sound, settled. The children are loud, not a complaint, only a fact. Ollie talks constantly. Hasn't stopped since he came out talking. Hattie asks questions with no easy answers. Always has. My husband used to say she'd end up a lawyer. She hadn't voiced Elias's name aloud in weeks. It sat in the cabin air, strange and familiar together. How long ago? 6 weeks before the meeting. Fever, 4 days start to finish. He was quiet, not hunting for a response, only understanding some things don't need one. He had a good eye for people, she went on, past the point of pretense. He would have found something to say to you, must be useful. It was. Never had it myself. Find conversation difficult, same. They sat a while in something that, if not comfortable, was at least honest. 2 people used to silence, a sleeping baby between them like a small warm anchor. Storm should break by Thursday. He rose eventually, checking the fire. Maybe Wednesday. How do you know that? 8 years on this mountain, you learn to read it. The cold came in with the door, and then he was gone, and Winifred sat with her daughter and thought about a man whose solitude was so complete. Even his grief had been organized onto shelves. Thursday came clear and brutally cold, the mountain emerging from 3 new feet of snow with the sharp stillness of high country after weather passes. The children poured off the porch in a wave. Even Eli, who'd kept his careful distance from anything resembling enjoyment, turned his face to the pale sun and was, for one moment, simply 13. Boone split wood at the pile, watching them. Winifred came to stand a few feet off with Ivy against her chest. You were right about Wednesday, usually am, about weather. She kept her voice low. Eli, go help Mr. Calder with the wood. Something crossed her son's face, none of it simple, but he crossed the yard and carried a split log to the stack. Boone split another. Eli carried that too. Neither spoke for a while. Water runs off the wood instead of into it, keeps it from rotting. Nobody told me that. Now somebody has. He unstacked the top 3 and restacked them bark down. And Boone split more wood without another word. And that was how it started. Not with warmth, not with any single dramatic turn, but bark side down, instead of up, and the plain utility of a thing done correctly. Winifred watched from the porch and felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief yet, the possibility of it somewhere ahead. The weeks after settled into a shape she could work with, mornings of fire and lessons, afternoons of outdoor work, suppers and stories, and children up to the loft in stages. She and Boone rarely lingered over conversation. Not easy. Fine. She learned the cabin, every choice made for function, nothing decorative, except one thing she never asked about, a faded blue ribbon on the high shelf above the bed, where you wouldn't see it unless you were looking. She was certain it had been Rose's. She learned his patterns, awake before dawn, always. Rarely a word before his coffee. Checking weather each morning from the open door, his eyes on the sky. Meticulous about his tools, quietly irritated when they weren't returned properly. And he learned hers, stopped walking through the kitchen when she had something hot on the fire, started knocking before coming in from outside, though she'd never asked. Small, unannounced adjustments that said, without a word, I'm paying attention even when it doesn't show." The children were harder to read in their own separate ways. Ivy's fever broke properly in the 3rd week and stayed broken. Josie settled into cabin life with the easy adaptability of small children, her own corner, Bramble, her routines, and she was fine. Ollie threw himself into every scrap of outdoor knowledge Boone would part with, and the snare lesson was a modest success. 2 rabbits and 1 minor catastrophe when Ollie checked a snare alone and came back with a rabbit and a scratched hand. Boone looked at the hand, looked at the boy. Never alone. Ollie took it seriously. He never did it again. Hattie took to tracking. Nell grew fascinated with how Boone read weather and followed him out every morning, now serious and watchful, learning the language of cloud and wind. Silas helped wherever needed and wanted almost nothing, which worried Winifred more than the louder children did. She knew her quiet second boy absorbed things and let them work on him in the dark, and made time for just the 2 of them. Eli was the one she watched most closely. He was settling, or something close to it, working alongside Boone now without open resistance, and there were moments, more frequent as December deepened, where she caught them in actual conversation, brief and functional but real. Eli was 13 and carrying the weight of feeling responsible for a family that wasn't fully his to carry, and something in the way Boone handed him real information and real problems to work through was doing something slow and useful for him. She kept it to herself, uncertain it would survive the saying. By the 4th week, the cold had settled so deep, it stopped feeling like weather at all, and started feeling like the true condition of the world. Wood consumption ran higher than Boone had calculated for. 9 people opening and closing the door, the fire built high for baths and cooking, and a baby who used heat in ways one careful bachelor's math had never accounted for. He didn't mention it, she noticed anyway. "We're using too much wood," she brought up one evening. "We have enough. Through February, maybe into March if we're careful. And if we're not, we'll be careful. We need to be. I've managed worse on this mountain, alone. 9 people changes the math, not the principle. You manage what you have. And if that's not enough, a beat, then—" She would remember that sentence later, the plain certainty of it, and how brutally that certainty was tested by what came after. The food ran out the way a tide goes, gradual, then suddenly final. Flour stretched 3 weeks before it became flour, only by generosity of definition. The dried beans went the week after Christmas. The venison Boone had stored lasted longer than expected, because Winifred had quietly cut her own portions to almost nothing since early December, hoping the children hadn't noticed. He started leaving half his food at the edge of his bowl and pushing it toward Josie without looking at his mother, and the first time she saw it, she had to turn to the fire before she trusted her own face. By mid-January, what remained was a partial sack of cornmeal, 3 jars of preserved plums, and 12 pounds of salt pork Boone found forgotten in the outbuilding. 12 pounds was not a food supply for 9 people through a mountain winter. It was a delay. Boone did the accounting at the table one Tuesday evening after the children were asleep, and reached the end of it with the stillness of a man who'd already accepted the answer before confirming it. 2 weeks. Ollie's lost weight. I can see it in his face. If I cut him again, I know I'm going to hunt. You've been hunting short trips, coming back with nothing. 3 times out of 4, the lower slopes are hunted out. Not up here, higher. She knew this mountain well enough by now to know exactly what higher meant. How high? Far enough to find elk. seen sign on the upper trails before the big storms buried it. They winter above the ridgeline where wind keeps the grass clear. And the avalanche risk a pause, a beat too long. Manageable. That's not what manageable sounds like. What do you want me to say? The truth. The northeast ridge is loaded right now. But the elk will be on the southern exposure above the second draw. Different aspect, more stable. 8 years on this mountain, I know the safe lines. You knew them when it was only you taking the risk. Something shifted in his face, not quite acknowledgement, but close. The alternative is the children go hungry. She sat with that, the way you sit with something true and terrible that refuses to become less of either. How long will you be gone? 2 days, maybe 3. He glanced at the window, that involuntary weather habit she'd watched him perform 100 times now. Thursday, if the sky holds. There's a front behind the next one. I need to be up and down before it arrives. And if you're not back by then, I'll be back. Take the rifle, not just the bow. And the emergency kit, the one on the 3rd shelf. I know where it is. She waited until he looked at her. Come back. It was a simple thing to say. She wasn't entirely certain what she meant by it, all of it probably. Come back with food. Come back alive. Come back to 7 children who had begun to depend on him in ways they couldn't yet put into words. Come back because I have moved my whole family into your life, and none of us know how to subtract you from it anymore. She said none of that. Only come back, yes? She believed him, not because of any reasonable guarantee, but because in 6 weeks she had learned that Boone Calder meant what he committed to. Thursday came cold and clear. He was packed before the children woke, checking and rechecking the weight of his gear. He'd told them the night before, plainly, without minimizing, food was needed, he was going to get it, back in 2 or 3 days. Nell wanted to know about the weather, and when he gave her what he'd given Winifred, she studied the sky. The high clouds were moving from the northwest. Good eye. She stood a little straighter the rest of the morning. Fire needs restocking by midday. He swung his pack on. Don't let the coals go too low. The loose porch board, left side, keep the little ones off the edge. The nails are working up, I know. He looked at her, then at the cabin, a half-second longer than a practical assessment required, and turned and went, his tracks a straight line into the new snow toward the upper tree line. Within 10 minutes the trees had swallowed him whole, and the mountain looked exactly as it always looked, enormous, white, entirely indifferent. The first day was manageable. Eli and Silas handled the outdoor work, the younger ones kept to lessons and a long game of Hattie's invention, whose rules changed every 20 minutes to Ollie's outrage. Winifred caught herself listening for the sound of Boone's boots on the porch and the knock before he entered, and realized only when it didn't come. By the second day Cloud moved in, not the front he'd warned of. That was still a day out, but a lower system that cut visibility and dropped the temperature further. Eli spent most of the afternoon at the window, watching the tree line, thinking exactly what she was thinking. He said 2 to 3 days without turning around. It's been 2. He knows this mountain better than anyone, she answered, almost to herself. Yes, he didn't come by nightfall of the second day. Winifred put the children to bed and sat by the fire with Ivy asleep in her lap. He wasn't back by dawn of the third day either, and the weather was moving faster now than he'd predicted. The front was coming a full day early. She built the fire high, fed the children from the dwindling stores the salt pork down to its last pounds, cornmeal measured in spoonfuls. Ollie ate without complaining, which told her more than anything how hungry he'd truly gotten. Ellie watched his mother give the last of her own portion to Josie. "Mama, eat." By mid-morning the wind had picked up in earnest, the sky gone flat and businesslike, and Winifred was standing on the porch, arms wrapped around herself, eyes fixed on the tree line, when she heard it, not footsteps, something else, low and irregular. "There," Eli pointed. Something was moving through the trees, and it wasn't moving right. It was Boone, walking wrong, favoring one side, his left arm held close against his ribs, his coat torn at the shoulder and stiff with something dark that had frozen and cracked and frozen again. Eli was off the porch before Winifred could call him back, running through calf-deep snow, getting a shoulder under his good arm, and between the two of them, boy and wounded man, they made the last stretch to the door while Winifred sent the older children for water. He'd found the herd, he explained later, in pieces between long stretches of silence while she worked. A cougar had found him first, come out of cover fast and low while the rifle jammed in the cold, and he'd fought it off with a knife because he had nothing else, killed it finally, and packed out what elk meat he could carry because the children were hungry, and he'd come too far to turn back empty-handed. The wound in his shoulder was deep and ragged, torn more than cut, dressed badly in the field and falling snow, 3 hours from the cabin with a storm arriving early. He slept 14 hours straight, the clearest measure of how depleted he was. She cleaned the wound as well as she knew how, packed it, changed the dressing, kept the fire built high through the worst of the storm that had arrived a full day ahead of schedule, and sat up listening to him breathe. "We are not going to die," she thought, stirring the pot of meat that finally filled the cabin with a smell other than smoke and cornmeal. "Not today, not on this mountain, not this winter." She should have expected it, a wound like that. Hastily dressed in the field 3 hours from any real care, didn't take kindly to best efforts no matter how thorough. By evening, he was hot to the touch and not entirely present behind his own eyes, and Winifred understood with the particular clear cold of a woman who had already buried one man. She cleaned the wound again by lamplight, found it worse, did what she could. She sat through that night and the next, replacing compresses, unable to be certain if the infection was holding or worsening. She was not a doctor, only a woman who had kept 7 children alive through ordinary winters by paying attention and refusing to panic, and she turned those same tools on an extraordinary one with no confidence they'd be enough. They had to be. By the 3rd day, the children had rearranged the whole cabin around it. The table moved to the wall for floor space. Lessons moved to the loft. Silas's voice pitched low. Eli sat near Boone for an hour that afternoon, just set a piece of wood and his knife in his hands. Not working either. Simply present the way you're present, when presence is the only thing you have to give. Winifred saw it and let it be. On the morning of the 4th day, the fever broke. She knew, before she'd fully registered, knowing something in the rhythm of his breathing changed at dawn, deepened, slowed, and when she laid a hand against his forehead, the heat was different now, coming down off its peak. She sat back in the chair that 4 days had turned into hers, and put her face in her hands and simply breathed. "You're crying." The words came out low, roughened by 4 days of silence. His eyes were clear, actually clear, the fever brightness gone. Something entirely his own looking back at her. "I'm not," she managed. "Water." His voice was a wreck, dry and barely there. She helped him drink, and he took it without argument. Plain proof of how weak he still was. How long? 4 days. He was quiet, processing the lost time, the gap in his awareness, everything that had gone on without him. "The children are fine. Eli managed the outside work. Your boy fixed the loose porch board properly while you were out. Said you'd shown him how. He's always listening. Doesn't always let you see it. I said things, didn't I?" Not a question, the words of a man who'd clearly done this before and woken already knowing it. Some things. Rose. Yes. He was quiet a while. She watched the familiar line of his scar, grown ordinary enough by now that it had stopped being the first thing she noticed. Wasn't a secret. He decided to go on. Flat, precise, the way he laid out things he decided to say and wasn't going to unsay. Told her I'd be back before dark. Ran 3 hours late over trouble with the horse, and the snow load came off the roof's east side while I was gone. She didn't survive the impact. That part wasn't slow. The doctor told me that much. But I was 3 hours late. You didn't cause the snow. No. Then, I know it, in the tone of a man who understands something fully in his head that his gut has never once agreed to accept. 8 years I've known it. Knowing doesn't change what I did with the knowing. She understood that in the particular way only another person who has lost someone understands it. That grief isn't logical, that a person can be acquitted by every reasonable measure and still sit with it in the dark, unmoved. She hadn't meant to start a sentence only to say the name, to establish she stood in the same territory. I was angry at him for dying. 3 weeks after, I was furious with him, as if he'd chosen it. That's not reasonable either. Doesn't stop it being true? No, it doesn't. They sat with that. The fire spoke its small language. The children used your name while you were sick. I didn't correct them. I should have asked first. It's fine. The answer came fast enough that its speed carried more than the words did. It's fine. She let it go, the way she'd learned to give him room when he'd said more than he'd intended. You need to eat. She stood straightening out the aches of 4 nights in a chair. Broth, if you can manage it, not hungry. That's not the same as not needing to. His recovery was slow, and he made a terrible patient, not from complaint, but from an incapacity for stillness with the cabin's constant list of things needing doing. She caught him attempting to split wood on the second day and took the axe from his reach. With a look he met with one of his own, both aware he could take it back if he chose, and both aware he wouldn't. Eli. She called instead, and her son appeared. Take the axe. He came down and lifted it from the space between them with the careful neutrality of someone staying clear of a conversation that wasn't his. I'll get the wood, not deferential, just practical. One capable person telling another, temporarily not capable, I've got it. Boone looked at the boy a moment, then at Winifred. Fine. He went back inside. Ollie, once Boone's eyes were reliably open again, informed him within roughly 3 minutes that he was his hero. I just got the food. You fought a mountain lion. That's still a lion, Boone attempted, and Ollie remained unmoved. All right, Boone allowed. Ollie beamed at him, uncomplicated and generous. And Boone regarded the beam like a man looking at something too bright to name. Were you scared? Hattie wanted to know. It's a fair question, Nell put in with the expression of someone taking notes. Yes, a pause, more honest than evasive. When it came out of the trees. For a second, what did you do? Kept moving. Hattie considered it good advice. It's the only advice. Spring did not arrive the way it does in stories. No single sudden morning, no birdsong, no clean thaw. It came the way real things come gradually, imperfectly, with setbacks. A warm week in late February, undone by 3 days of hard freeze. Bare patches on the south slope, buried again, under 6 new inches, then bare again. The creek, moving beneath its ice, with a low sound, the children pressed their ears to frozen ground to hear. By early April, the lower trail was passable, and the world below the mountain came back into view. The smudge of Black Ridge in the valley, chimney smoke, the thin brown thread of road through the last snow. The roads are open. He stood at the door one Thursday with his coffee, eyes on the valley. If you wanted to go down, you could. She was at the fire with Ivy walking, now crossing the floor toward Josie with the wobbling urgency of a child who'd decided crawling was beneath her. I heard you. I told you at the start. When spring came, you were free to leave. The Marlowe family's already gone to Laramie. Ridgeton's taking people in. Boone. He stopped. Are you asking me to leave? She turned to face him fully. The particular pause she knew well by now, the one that meant he was being careful with language because the language mattered. I'm telling you, you're allowed to. Those are different things. Yes, I'm not going. Not back to Black Ridge, not to Ridgeton, not to Laramie. Winifred, her full name, with the careful weight of a man who'd spent a whole winter thinking about what came after. This is my mountain, my cabin. You don't owe me. I know I don't owe you anything. Her voice came out sharper than intended, and she gentled it. That isn't what this is. I'm not staying out of debt. Then what are you staying for? She looked at him a long moment. The scar, the gray coming into his beard, the hands that had dragged an elk through snow and built this cabin log by careful log. The man who'd stacked wood bark side down and named Rose's hatred of the cold like it was the truest thing he could offer about a person. Because this is home. Whether you meant it to become one or not, it did, and I'm not taking my children away from something that became home just because you're holding the door open and telling me I'm allowed to leave through it. The cabin held the silence a moment. Ivy reached the table leg, pulled herself up, and looked around for an audience to admire the accomplishment. I don't know how to do this. Do what? This. A small motion, taking in the cabin, the children, her, all of it. I've been alone 8 years. I make mistakes. I'm not easy to be around. I've noticed. I'm not going to, suddenly, become easy to be around. I'm not asking you to. The children need, he stopped, tried again. They need exactly what they've been getting. Someone who teaches them real things and tells them the truth and doesn't handle them like they'll break. 5 months of that and they are not the same children who came up this mountain in November. Ollie will set a snare correctly before he's 8. Nell reads weather better than half the men in Black Ridge. Eli, her voice did something she had to work to keep level. Eli is learning how to be a man from someone who actually knows how. Do you understand what that means to me? I'm not putting a weight on you. I'm answering the question you asked. What do you want? She pressed into the silence that followed. Not what you think is right. What do you actually want? He was not a man who answered questions like that quickly, or often turned them on himself. She watched him actually work through it, not deflect. "I don't want you to leave." He got it out finally, and because he'd apparently decided that if he was going to say it, he'd say it all the way through. "Any of you, I don't want you to go." It wasn't romantic or dressed up in anything. It was a man who'd spent 8 years building walls, telling her the walls had stopped being his primary concern, and it landed as worth more than anything prettier could have. "Then we're staying." He looked at her another moment, picked up his coffee, and that was that the work of spring suited this household better than the work of winter had. Boone marked out a second room off the east wall, plain necessity, since 9 people in one room and a loft had been survivable through winter, but wasn't any long-term arrangement. He drew it in the dirt with a stick, and Eli crouched beside him asking questions, specific enough that Boone gave him the same detail he'd give someone he expected to actually help build it. Something in his face that had been held one particular way all winter eased. They started the addition the 3rd week of April. Hard, exhausting work, but a different kind of tired than winter's productive, forward-facing, rather than merely endured. Silas found a tin of seeds at the back of the storage shelf and brought it to his mother with the gravity of someone presenting something important. Squash, beans, 2 kinds of root vegetable. "Can things grow up here?" "At this elevation, in a short season, we'd have to do it right. Raised beds, southern exposure, sheltered from wind. I could build them, not someone should. Not maybe I could, ask I could." She looked at her quiet second son, who'd spent the whole winter absorbing everything and wanting almost nothing, and knew she'd been right to worry about him, the kind of boy who could carry a great deal before anyone noticed he needed something of his own. Boone showed him a south-facing patch below the cabin, sheltered by an outcrop that ran a few degrees warmer, and by week's end there was a raised bed taking shape in the thawing ground. Silas's project, the way the snares had been ollies and the weather log had become Nell's. Hattie found her project in the roof's east corner, warped by a heavy February load. "What's wrong with it?" She stood with her arms crossed, looking up. "Corner board's warped. Need replacing." "You afraid of heights?" "No." "Sure, I'll tell you if I'm. Once I'm up there, ladders in the outbuilding." She wasn't immediately good at it, dropped 2 boards the second day, and climbed back down for them, hit her thumb with the hammer on the 3rd, and used a word Winifred chose, from inside the cabin. By week's end, the corner was solid, and Hattie carried the look of someone who has done a physical thing correctly and knows it from somewhere deep inside. Josie planted flowers, no organization to it. Wildflower seeds moved with great ceremony to whatever patch of dirt she decided deserved them that day. Most wouldn't survive. "It's going to be yellow," she informed Boone with absolute confidence, holding up a seed. "How do you know?" She considered the question seriously. "Because I want it to be." "All right." He was quiet a moment first. Winifred, coming out with a water bucket, caught the tail of it and watched something cross Boone's face she hadn't seen before, unguarded in a way that seemed to cost him a man in the presence of something that had gotten past every careful defense he owned. He caught her watching, and the look closed, just with the reflexive privacy of someone still learning how much to let show. She let it pass. 2 riders came up the mountain trail a Wednesday morning in May, Lloyd Perrin and Reverend Colby, the same men who'd sat at the front of that assembly hall in November and priced out the cost of separating her children. Boone saw them from the upper yard and went to stand at the property's edge, arms at his sides, his whole body making clear how far they'd be permitted to come. Winifred came out to the porch. Lloyd's eyes moved over the cabin, the framed addition, the garden beds, something crossing his face between surprise and recalculation. "Looks like you've been busy. What do you want, Lloyd?" The Reverend's tone was smoother. "We came to check on Mrs. Cole and the children as a community. We felt—" Winifred came down the steps to stand beside Boone. "You came up here in May to check whether I'd done something improper during a winter I spent keeping 7 children alive. That's what this is. You weren't concerned in November. In November, you were ready to send Eli to the Draper place as farm labor." She let it sit. "You can see for yourselves how my children are, but you don't get to ride up here and make me justify the man who kept them alive." The children were in fact thoroughly seen. Ollie talked at Lloyd for 6 straight minutes about elk tracking and snare mechanics. Nell showed the Reverend her weather log, real dates, real observations, Boone's small annotations in the margin where she'd gotten something right, and he looked at it with genuine surprise. They ate on the porch in thin spring sun, all 9 of them, and the 2 visitors imperfect and a little awkward and entirely itself. "For what it's worth," Lloyd got out slowly, mounting up to leave, "we were wrong about what to do with your family." He glanced at Boone. "And about you." Winifred stood at the porch edge and watched them ride down the trail and felt something release she hadn't known she was still carrying. The low, quiet need to be vindicated by people once ready to scatter her family like seed. She'd known since February she didn't need it. It still felt like setting something down. Boone came to stand beside her. "They'll talk. Now people will want to know how it was done. Is that a problem?" "No, I don't think it is." The addition was finished by the end of May, rough but solid, and Eli had done a full third of the work himself. The notching on his section, good work, Boone allowed, and from a man who didn't hand out praise carelessly. Eli looked at his own notching, then at the ground, and Winifred watched her oldest son feel the quiet, specific pleasure of being credited by someone whose opinion he'd earned. Silas's garden brought in beans and 1 variety of squash before the first frost, small and dense, and everyone agreed the best thing anyone had eaten since Black Ridge's stores ran dry. He carried the first harvest to the table with a formality entirely unself-conscious, and it made even Boone set down his coffee to look at it properly. "You grew this, we grew it. I planted the yellow flowers, some of them came up yellow." "You were right about that." Josie looked at him with the deep satisfaction of a girl whose confidence in her own judgment had just been publicly confirmed. It was Eli who finally named it, directly, the way Eli named most things. An evening in late June, the door opened for the first time all year, daylight lasting nearly to 9. Boone at the table working on a piece of equipment, Winifred across from him mending something that didn't strictly need mending. Eli came in from outside, looked at the plain domestic ease of 2 people who no longer had to negotiate the same space, and wanted to know whether they were going to get married, or just sit across from each other like that forever. He's not wrong. His expression was doing several things. At once, embarrassment, acknowledgement, and something underneath, both that had been there a while, she thought, probably since the fever. "This is painful." Eli was already retreating. "I'm going back outside." He went. She looked at Boone across the table, this man who was not easy and was never going to be simple, who had fed her children when she couldn't, and walked back through blood and snow because he'd committed to it, and put wood bark side down because it was the correct way to do it. I'm not looking for someone to save me. I want that understood. I know, and I don't want either of us to be a replacement. But he reached across the table anyway, and she put her hand over his, the scarred working hand, and held it there, and he turned his palm to meet hers, and held on. That was how it started in the end, no flourish. A hand across a table in the last light of a summer evening, on a mountain that had very nearly killed them all, and had turned out, against every prediction, to be home. Life on that mountain was never going to be perfect after that, and it wasn't. Boone stayed difficult to live with in his own particular way. Winifred stayed unable to ask for help even when she plainly needed it. Eli stayed 13, with all the friction that implied. But the cabin had 2 rooms now, and the garden had come in, and next winter's woodpile was already half built by the time the first frost threatened. Ollie could set a snare and read 5 kinds of animal track, and had firmly decided to become the finest trapper in the territory, a declaration Boone received with more patience than Black Ridge would have predicted the previous November. Nell kept her weather log faithfully, Hattie could fix a roof, Silas grew things. And down along the south-facing rocks below the cabin, in the full summer sun, Josie's flowers came up yellow, small and crooked. It was not what any of them would have chosen if anyone had ever handed them the choosing. Nothing that grows out of desperation and a hard winter, and a scarred stranger walking into a room to say, "I'll take all of them," ever looks like a plan. It looks like what it actually is, a family built out of necessity and stubbornness, and the specific, unglamorous shape love takes when it isn't grand about itself. Bark side down cool, compresses at 3 in the morning, "I don't want you to leave," a hand held across a table when the words finally run out. It wasn't what any of them would have designed, it was what they had. And by the time that first real summer settled warm over the mountain, all 9 of them had come, in their own separate ways, to understand the same simple thing. It was more than enough. If Winifred and Boone's story stayed with you tonight, do one small thing before you go. Become a channel member and tap "Join" right beside the channel name. It helps more than you'd think, and it's the surest way to make sure the next story, like this one, finds its way to you.